Okay, so you know how it is like trying to stay on top of all the big, the breakthroughs in science?
Right.
It's like a full-time job.
Absolutely.
So consider this your little cheat sheet for today, because we're going to do a deep dive on some new Alzheimer's research.
Yeah.
And this isn't just another study that says, oh, maybe we have a way to diagnose it a little earlier.
Right.
This is like a much deeper way of looking at what's actually happening in the brain.
Yeah, that's right. I think one of the things that's so intriguing about this is it gives us a much better picture of like where a person is at in their disease process.
Huh?
And that's really important because we have some treatments now that are working.
Yeah.
And they seem to work best the earlier you catch the disease.
Totally. So it's like not just do you have it or don't you have it, but like how far along
Right, exactly.
are you in this?
Mm.
And that's going to make a huge difference in how it's treated.
Absolutely.
So the stuff that we're looking at today is some really cool research from Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis
Okay.
and also Lund University in Sweden.
Interesting.
And all this has been published in Nature Medicine, which is like, a pretty top-notch journal.
Yeah, absolutely.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack what this new test is and like why everybody's so excited about it.
Right.
And what this might mean for how we treat Alzheimer's in the future.
Well, then let's do it.
Okay, so before we like jump into the specifics of this new test,
Okay.
maybe we should take a step back and like think about the current state of how we assess Alzheimer's right now.
Yeah, so we do have some blood tests already.
Yeah,
In fact, some of them were developed at Washington University.
Oh, cool.
And those are helpful for diagnosing people who are already having cognitive symptoms.
Okay, so, but they're not necessarily so good at saying like, oh, you're in stage 1 or stage 2 of this.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah. They can tell you maybe you have Alzheimer's disease, but they don't really tell you, how far along you are
I see.
in that process.
So we're missing a piece of information.
Yeah, we are.
Which is like, how bad is it, essentially?
Exactly. And that's a problem because doctors really need to know how far along somebody is.
Yeah.
Because that helps them decide, who's going to benefit from treatment and how aggressively to treat them.
Right, because the treatment for someone in the very beginning might be totally different
Exactly.
than someone who's, much further along.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would also imagine that it's sometimes hard to tease apart Alzheimer's from other conditions
Yeah.
that maybe have similar kinds of symptoms.
Absolutely. Yeah, that can be really tricky. And that's another area where this new research is showing a lot of promise.
Interesting. Okay, so let's like get down to brass tacks here. What is this new test all about?
So the big finding here is that there's a specific protein in the blood called MTBR-TOD243.
Okay.
And if you measure the levels of this protein, it can give you a much better understanding of what's actually going on in the brain.
Okay, so MTBR-TOD243.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a mouthful.
It is.
What is it about this particular protein that makes it so special?
What's really fascinating is that the levels of this protein in the blood actually reflect how much of this toxic tau protein has built up in the brain in these tangles.
Wow.
And so the key thing to remember is tau is one of the proteins that we know is really involved in Alzheimer's disease.
Got it.
And the more of it you have, the worse your Alzheimer's is.
So higher levels of this MTBR-TOD243 mean more of that bad tau stuff in the brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what they showed in this research was that they could actually distinguish between people with early Alzheimer's and late Alzheimer's just by looking at the levels of this protein in the blood.
Wow.
And even more excitingly, they could tell the difference between people who had Alzheimer's and people whose cognitive problems were caused by something else.
Wow. So it's not only telling you maybe you have Alzheimer's or not,
Right.
but also like, is this actually Alzheimer's or is this something else?
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so.
And that's really important.
Yeah.
Because it helps us, know that we're treating the right thing.
Totally.
One of the senior authors on the study, Dr. Randall Bateman,
Okay.
he summed it up really well. He said, this blood test clearly identifies Alzheimer's tau tangles, which is our best biomarker measure of Alzheimer's symptoms and dementia.
So he's basically saying like this is a direct line to the thing that is actually causing the problems.
Exactly.
And it's a really important point.
It is.
Because right now, there isn't a really easy way to measure those tau tangles.
Right.
Especially in like a normal doctor's office.
Yeah, absolutely not. Typically you would need a PET scan or something like that, which is not something that's readily available.
Right.
So to be able to get this information from a simple blood test is a really big deal.
Totally. I mean, and he also said that this, will help doctors make better decisions about how to treat people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to understand why that's so important, we need to take a minute to talk about how Alzheimer's actually progresses.
What?
We know that the disease involves the buildup of these proteins in the brain, right? One is amyloid, and it forms these plaques.
Yeah.
And then later on, tau forms these tangles.
So it's kind of a two-step process in a way.
Yeah,
Huh.
you could think about it that way. And
Well,
the thing is, amyloid starts building up first.
okay.
But it's really when the tau tangles start showing up that people start having cognitive problems.
Interesting. So amyloid's kind of like the first domino,
Right.
but it's the tau that actually causes the symptoms that we think of as Alzheimer's.
Yeah, exactly. The amyloid is kind of setting the stage.
Okay.
And then the tau is the one that's really causing the damage.
I see.
And so the cognitive symptoms usually appear around the same time that we can start to detect the tau tangles.
Okay.
And as those tangles spread, the symptoms get worse.
Got it. So really the tau is the key here
Yeah, it's a really important piece of the puzzle.
to understanding how bad the disease is.
Yep.
Okay. So I know that right now the best way to really see what's happening with amyloid and tau is through PT scans.
Right. That's the gold standard.
But those are not exactly, easy to come by.
No, they're not. They're expensive and they take a long time. And not every hospital has a PT scanner.
Right.
So you often have to travel to a big city to get one.
Totally. So it's not like, you can just go to your regular doctor and say, hey, let's do a PT scanner.
Right.
Okay, so this is why having a blood test
Yeah,
is such a big deal because it's so much more accessible.
absolutely.
Okay, cool. And I know that this isn't the first time that Dr. Bateman's team has worked on blood tests for Alzheimer's.
No, that's right. They've been doing a lot of work in this area.
Yeah.
In fact, they've already developed a couple of blood tests that can measure amyloid levels in the brain.
Wow.
And those are actually being used by doctors now
That's amazing.
to help diagnose Alzheimer's. But what's really new and exciting about this MTBR-TAW243 test is that it's the first one that can tell us about tau levels in the brain.
Okay, so they're building on their previous work with amyloid.
Exactly.
And now they've added this new piece about tau, which we've just been saying is so important.
Right, because that's the one that really correlates with the symptoms.
Right, exactly.
So it's a huge step forward.
Okay, so how did they actually figure this out? Like, how did they do this research?
So this actually builds on some earlier work that they did,
Okay.
where they looked at MTBR-TAW243 in the cerebrospinal fluid.
Okay, so that's the fluid that's like around your brain and spinal cord.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they found that the levels of this protein in the cerebrospinal fluid correlated really well with the amount of tau tangles that they saw on brain scans.
Interesting.
But the problem with using cerebrospinal fluid is that you have to get it through a spinal tap.
Right, which is not exactly a fun procedure.
No, it's not.
It's pretty invasive.
Yeah, it is. So the real breakthrough here is that they figured out a way to measure MTBR-TAW243 in the blood.
Okay, so way easier
Much easier.
than a spinal tap.
Yeah, just a simple blood draw. And so what they did was they took blood samples from a bunch of people,
All right.
and they measured the levels of MTBR-TAW243 in those samples, and then they compared those levels to what they saw on the participants' brain scans.
So they could see, like, does the blood test actually match up
Exactly.
with what's going on in the brain?
Right.
Got it. And who are all these people that they were doing this research on?
So they had two main groups of people. The first group was 108 volunteers from Washington University's Alzheimer's Disease Research Center.
Okay.
And then the second group was a smaller subset of 55 individuals from something called the Swedish Biofinder 2 cohort.
Okay.
And then they actually validated their findings in an even larger group of 739 people
Wow.
who were also part of that Biofinder 2 study.
Okay, so lots of different people to make sure
Exactly.
that this wasn't just like a fluke or something.
Right.
And were these people all like at the same stage of Alzheimer's? Or?
No, they were at all different stages. They had people who were pre-symptomatic, so they didn't have any cognitive problems yet.
But they had amyloid in their brains, so they were at risk for developing Alzheimer's.
Oh.
They had people with mild cognitive impairment, so they were starting to have some problems with their thinking and memory.
Okay.
And then they had people with full-blown dementia.
Okay, so the whole spectrum.
Yeah, the whole spectrum.
Got it.
And they also had some healthy people who didn't have any amyloid in their brains.
Okay.
And they had some people who had cognitive problems caused by things other than Alzheimer's.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so that was really important to make sure that the test could actually distinguish between Alzheimer's and other conditions.
Right, because if it's elevated in all kinds of cognitive problems,
Right.
then it's not that helpful.
Exactly.
Okay, so what did they find when they did all this research?
Okay, so the results were really impressive. They found that the blood levels of MTBR-TAW243 were 92% accurate in predicting the amount of tau tangles in the brain.
Wow, so pretty darn accurate.
Yeah, very accurate.
And what was really interesting was that in the people who were pre-symptomatic,
Yeah.
their MTBR TAR 243 levels were normal.
Even though they had amyloid.
Even though they had amyloid, yeah.
Wow, so this is really suggesting that this test is picking up on like the actual damage
Right.
from the tau, not just the amyloid.
Exactly. And that's really important because remember, it's the tau that's causing the symptoms.
Right, exactly. Okay, so what about the people who were already having symptoms?
So in the people with mild cognitive impairment, the MTBR TAW 243 levels were significantly higher
Okay.
than in the pre-symptomatic people. And then in the people with dementia, the levels were even higher, like up to 200 times higher.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
Yeah, it is.
So it's not only saying like yes or no you have Alzheimer's.
Yeah, right.
It's actually giving you a sense of like how far along you are.
Exactly.
Which, as we said in the beginning, is super important
Absolutely.
for treatment and stuff.
Yeah, for deciding what kind of treatment to give and when to give it.
Right.
I
yeah.
see.
Okay, and what about the people who had cognitive problems that weren't caused by Alzheimer's?
So in those people, the MTBR TAR 243 levels were normal.
Ah, okay, so that's good.
Yeah, that means the test is really specific to Alzheimer's.
It's not just picking up on like any kind of cognitive problem.
Right, exactly.
That's awesome. Okay, so it sounds like this test is like super promising
It is.
for both diagnosis and for understanding how far along someone is in the disease.
Absolutely.
Is this something that is going to be available to like regular people soon, or is this still like a research thing?
So the technology for this test has been licensed to a company called C2N Diagnostics.
Okay.
And this is the same company that developed the blood tests for amyloid that are already being used.
Oh,
So it's likely that this MTBR TAW 243 test will become commercially available at some point.
oh, that's exciting.
Yeah, it is.
And you mentioned earlier that there are other blood tests for tau that are being developed.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like, how does this new test fit in with those?
So there's one in particular that measures something called p-tau 217.
Okay.
And Dr. Oscar Hansen, who's one of the senior authors on this study, he thinks that p-tau 217 is probably going to be the go-to test for initially diagnosing Alzheimer's.
Okay.
But he sees MTBR TAW 243 as a really important complementary test.
So kind of like a 1-2 punch.
Yeah, exactly.
First you see if they have it, and then you see
right.
like how bad is it.
Exactly. And he said that if both p-tau 217 and MTBR TAW 243 are elevated,
Okay.
that makes it much more likely that the person's cognitive problems are actually caused by Alzheimer's.
Interesting.
So it kind of increases your confidence in the diagnosis,
Totally.
and it also gives you more information about how far along they are in the disease.
Okay, cool. So it sounds like we're getting much better at like diagnosing and staging this disease,
We are.
which is so important because we also have new treatments that are coming out
Right.
that are actually able to slow down the progression of the disease.
Exactly.
So like, how does this all fit together?
So we already have 2 FDA-approved therapies that can lower amyloid levels in the brain.
Okay.
And there are a lot more experimental drugs in development. Some of them target tau,
Okay.
and some of them target other aspects of the disease.
Interesting.
And Dr. Kantahori, who's another researcher on this study, she said that we're basically entering the era of personalized medicine for Alzheimer's disease.
Okay.
So what that means is that we're going to be able to tailor treatments to individual patients based on their specific needs.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, it is. And this new blood test is going to be a really important part of that because it can help us figure out who's going to benefit from which treatment.
I see, because the person who has a lot of tau
Right.
might need a different approach
Exactly.
than the person who has, early Alzheimer's and not so much tau.
Right. And Dr. Hori actually gave a really good example. She said that for people in the early stages of the disease with low levels of tau, anti-amyloid therapies might be the best option. But for people who are further along and have high levels of tau, we might need to use something else like an anti-tau therapy.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And so having a blood test that can tell us about tau levels is going to be really helpful for making those decisions.
Totally. Yeah, it's all about like finding the right tool
Right.
for the right job
Exactly.
and for the right person.
Absolutely.
Wow, this is like mind-blowing.
It is.
So for you, the listener, what we really want you to take away from this
Mm.
is that this new blood test isn't just about, maybe diagnosing Alzheimer's a little earlier.
Right.
It's about understanding like the whole trajectory of the disease
Yeah,
and like where you are on that path. And that is going to make such a huge difference
it is.
in how we treat this disease.
Absolutely.
And it's all thanks to this new ability to measure those tau tangles,
Right.
which, as we've been saying, are like the real culprit here.
Yeah, the real bad guy.
So this is leading to better diagnosis,
Mm-mm.
more informed treatment decisions.
Yeah.
And this whole idea of personalized medicine for Alzheimer's,
Mm.
which is like super exciting.
It is really exciting.
Okay, so now that we have all this information, like, how does this change how we think about Alzheimer's?
Mm.
Like, what are the big questions that we need to be asking now that we have these new tools?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that we need to think about is how this is going to change our understanding of how the disease progresses.
Yeah.
Now that we can measure tau levels so accurately, we might be able to identify different subtypes of Alzheimer's
Sure, it
or
is-
different patterns of progression,
Okay.
and that could lead to even more personalized treatments.
I see.
Another thing to think about is how this is going to affect clinical trials.
Oh, yeah.
Now that we have this blood test, we can select participants for trials much more carefully.
Ah, okay. So we can make sure we're comparing apples to apples.
Exactly.
And not like mixing up different types of Alzheimer's.
Right.
Okay.
And that's going to make the results of those trials much more reliable
Totally. Yeah.
and hopefully lead to new treatments that are even more effective.
That's amazing. So, like, this is just the beginning.
Yeah, this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Wow.
It's a really exciting time to be working in this field.
That's so awesome. Well, thank you so much for breaking all of this down for us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to you, the listener, I hope you enjoyed this deep dive and that you learned a lot about this groundbreaking new research and how it might change the future of Alzheimer's disease.
Absolutely.
We'll be back next week with another deep dive into the latest scientific discoveries.
See you then.
Bye.